The candles had barely been lit when the first scream of laughter cracked across the ballroom, and Alara Finch nearly dropped the tray of bread rolls in her hands. Not because of the laughter itself, but because of who had caused it. Lady Priscilla Ashworth had just tripped over her own gown while trying to catch the attention of a man who had not looked at a single woman in that room all night. Duke Edmund Halewood stood near the tall windows with his arms folded, his face unreadable, while an entire hall of the wealthiest, most beautifully dressed women in the county tried and failed to win even a glance from him. Alara did not have time to watch. She had a kitchen full of half-finished dishes and a head cook who would shout her name the moment she paused for breath. She turned back toward the narrow servants' corridor, balancing the tray with practiced ease, and pushed through the swinging door into the noise and heat of Ashcombe Manor's kitchen. Steam rose from 3 enormous pots. Fire crackled under a spit where a whole pheasant turned slowly, dripping fat that hissed and sparked. Cooks shouted over each other, plates clattered, and somewhere a scullery boy dropped a bowl of flour with a startled cry. This was Alara's world, not silk and candlelight, but heat, noise, and the constant fear of falling behind. She was 17, thin from years of hard work, with dark hair always tucked under a plain cap and hands that carried more small burns and cuts than she could count. She had worked in this kitchen since she was 12 years old, ever since her mother passed and her father could no longer afford to feed her at home. The manor had taken her in as a favor to her father, an old friend of the estate's steward, and she had been grateful for it every single day, even on the hardest ones. "Alara, where are those rolls?" The head cook, a broad woman named Constance Whitfield, did not even turn from her pot as she shouted. "Here, Mrs. Whitfield," Alara said, setting the tray down and rushing to arrange the rolls into a neat pyramid on a silver serving dish, the way she had been taught. "Faster next time, girl. The Duke's guests do not like to wait, even if the Duke himself does not seem to care whether they leave hungry or not." Constance shook her head. "Strangest ball I have ever seen. All these fine ladies dressed like they are competing for a crown, and the man barely says 2 words to any of them." Alara said nothing. It was not her place to comment on the Duke's behavior, and besides, she had never once seen him up close. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone on the estate had. Duke Edmund Halewood, only 26 years old, had inherited the title and the manor 3 years ago after his father passed suddenly from a fever. Since then, he had thrown himself into managing the estate's finances and tenant farms with a seriousness that surprised everyone who expected a young lord to spend his fortune on parties and horses instead. He was said to be fair to his workers, strict with his stewards, and utterly uninterested in the endless parade of noblewomen paraded before him by hopeful families across the region. Tonight's ball had been arranged by his own aunt, Lady Margaret Halewood, who had grown tired of watching her nephew avoid every social gathering that might lead to marriage. She had invited every eligible young lady within 50 miles, certain that surely one of them would catch his eye. From what Alara could hear drifting in from the ballroom every time the door swung open, none of them had. "Take this platter of cheese out to the west table," Constance said, shoving another tray into Alara's hands. "And mind you do not spill anything on the good rugs, or it will come out of your wages." Alara nodded and hurried back through the swinging door, careful to keep her eyes down and her steps quiet, the way all the serving staff had been trained to move. Invisible, present but unnoticed, that was the goal. The ballroom was even more dazzling up close than it had sounded from the kitchen. Enormous chandeliers dripped golden light over rows of dancers in silk and lace. Musicians played from a raised platform at the far end of the hall, their violins weaving a bright, quick melody that filled every corner of the room. Alara kept her head down as she moved along the edge of the crowd, setting the cheese platter carefully on the long table, already crowded with delicacies few of the kitchen staff would ever taste. As she straightened, she caught a glimpse of him. Duke Edmund Halewood stood exactly where he had been standing for most of the evening, near the tall windows that overlooked the garden. He was tall, with dark hair swept back neatly, and a jaw set in the same serious expression Alara had heard described 100 times by the older servants. He wore his formal coat like it was a weight he was carrying rather than a garment he enjoyed, and though several young ladies had drifted near him throughout the evening, hoping for a word or a dance, he had offered nothing but polite nods and short replies before excusing himself. Alara did not know why she looked at him longer than she should have. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, the kind anyone might feel toward a man everyone in the county gossiped about. Or perhaps it was something else, some small flicker of understanding, because she recognized the tired look behind his eyes. It was not boredom, it was exhaustion. The same exhaustion she felt after a 16-hour day in the kitchen, except his came from being watched, judged, and pursued by every family desperate to attach themselves to his title. A firm hand touched her shoulder, and Alara startled, turning to find Constance's assistant, a stern woman named Beatrice, glaring at her. "You are not paid to stand and stare at the guests," Beatrice hissed. "Back to the kitchen now." Alara ducked her head and hurried away, her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She should not have looked. She should not have wondered. A duke and a kitchen maid existed in two different worlds that were never meant to touch, and she knew better than to let her mind wander somewhere so foolish, even for a moment. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of trays, dishes, and shouted instructions. Alara carried out course after course, refilled water pitchers, and helped clear plates as guests moved from the dining hall back to the ballroom for more dancing. Her feet ached, her arms felt heavy, and more than once she nearly walked into another servant rushing the opposite direction through the narrow halls that connected the kitchen to the main house. It was well past midnight when Constance finally allowed her a short break. "Go on then, get some air before you drop that tray on someone's head," the older woman said, not unkindly. 10 minutes, no more." Alara did not need to be told twice. She slipped out through the small side door near the pantry, the one that led into the manor's kitchen garden, and breathed in the cool night air like it was the finest thing she had tasted all evening. The noise of the ball faded into a distant hum behind the thick stone walls, replaced by the quiet chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The garden was not grand like the front grounds where guests sometimes wandered during warmer parties. This was a working garden, rows of herbs and vegetables that fed the household, bordered by a low stone wall and a few old fruit trees that had stood there longer than anyone could remember. Alara loved this place. It was the only spot on the entire estate that felt like it belonged to her, even a little. She walked slowly along the rows of rosemary and thyme, running her fingers over the leaves and letting the sharp, clean scent clear her head. Mrs. Whitfield had asked for fresh mint earlier, and though her break was meant for rest, Alara found herself pulling a few sprigs anyway, humming softly under her breath, an old tune her mother used to sing while cooking. She did not hear the footsteps until they were close. "That is a lovely sound," a voice said from somewhere behind her, "though I imagine you did not expect an audience." Alara spun around so quickly she nearly dropped the mint in her hands. A man stood a few feet away, half hidden in the shadow of one of the fruit trees, his formal coat unbuttoned and his hair slightly less neat than it had been earlier in the evening. For a moment in the darkness she did not recognize him. He looked younger somehow, less like the stern figure from the ballroom and more like someone simply enjoying a quiet moment away from the noise, just as she was. "I am sorry, sir," she said quickly, dropping into an awkward curtsy, the mint still clutched in one hand. "I did not think anyone would be out here. I will return to my duties at once." "There is no need to rush off," he said, stepping forward just enough for the moonlight to catch his face fully. Alara's stomach dropped as recognition hit her all at once. The dark hair, the tired eyes she had noticed from across the ballroom, the tall, composed figure that every guest inside had been trying to charm for hours. It was him. The Duke himself, standing not 10 feet away in his own kitchen garden, speaking to her as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "forgive me, I did not realize it was you." "Please," he said, and something in his tone softened. There is no need for such formality out here. I only came outside to escape the noise for a few minutes. I did not expect to find better company in the garden than I found in the entire ballroom. Alara did not know how to respond to that. Nothing in her years of training as a kitchen maid had prepared her for a conversation like this. She glanced toward the manor, half expecting Beatrice or Constance to appear and drag her back inside for daring to linger near the Duke. But the garden remained quiet and empty aside from the two of them. "I should not keep you from your evening, Your Grace," she said carefully. "Your guests will be wondering where you have gone." A short, humorless laugh escaped him. "My guests will be quite content without me for a few more minutes. In fact, I suspect several of them have not noticed my absence at all, so occupied are they with discussing whose gown is finer or whose family holds more land." He shook his head slightly. "It grows tiresome rather quickly." Alara pressed her lips together, unsure whether it would be improper to agree with him, even silently. She had grown up hearing whispers about the endless competitions among noble families, the marriages arranged more for land and title than affection, but she had never expected to hear a duke himself speak of it with such open weariness. "You seem surprised," he said, studying her expression. "Did you expect me to defend the evening's entertainment?" "I did not expect to be having this conversation at all, Your Grace," Alara admitted before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted the honesty. "Forgive me, that was not my place to say." But instead of frowning or dismissing her, the Duke actually smiled, a small, genuine thing that changed his entire face. "No, please do not apologize. It is the most honest thing anyone has said to me all evening." He gestured toward the mint in her hands. "What is that for, if I may ask?" "Mrs. Whitfield wanted fresh mint for the dessert course," Alara said, grateful for a safe topic. "She likes to add it to the cream when the weather is warm, says it makes the dish feel lighter." "Is that so?" He tilted his head, genuinely interested. "I confess I know very little about what happens in my own kitchen. I only know what appears on the table." "There is quite a lot that happens before it reaches the table," Alara said, a small smile tugging at her own lips now. "Hours of work, more often than not. Mrs. Whitfield says a good dish is like a good performance. No one sees the practice, only the final result." "That is a wise way to look at it." He studied her a moment longer, his expression thoughtful. "You speak differently than I expected." Alara's smile faded slightly, uncertain whether that was meant as a compliment or a warning that she had overstepped. "I apologize if I have spoken out of turn, Your Grace." "You have not," he said quickly, as though sensing her worry. "I only meant that most people who address me inside that ballroom choose their words as though they are walking across thin ice, terrified of saying the wrong thing and losing whatever favor they hope to gain. You speak plainly. It is refreshing." Before Alara could think of a proper reply, the sound of the side door creaking open cut through the quiet garden. Both of them turned to see a young manservant stepping outside, clearly searching for someone. "Your Grace," the servant called, spotting the Duke immediately, "your aunt is asking for you. She wishes for you to greet the Ashworth family before they depart." Duke Edmund exhaled slowly, the weariness returning to his face like a mask sliding back into place. "Of course, tell her I am on my way." As the servant disappeared back inside, he turned to Alara once more, and for a brief moment something unspoken passed between them, an understanding neither of them could quite name yet. "Thank you for the conversation," he said quietly. "It was the best part of my evening, strange as that may sound." Alara curtsied again, her heart pounding in a way she could not fully explain. "Good evening, Your Grace." He offered a small nod and walked back toward the manor, leaving Alara alone in the garden with a fistful of mint, and a mind suddenly full of questions she had no right to be asking. She stood there a moment longer, staring at the door he had disappeared through, before shaking herself back to attention. Constance would be furious if she took any longer than her 10 minutes, and there was still a mountain of dishes waiting inside. But as she hurried back toward the kitchen, the noise and heat rushing over her once more, she could not stop replaying the conversation in her mind. It made no sense. A duke did not linger in gardens speaking with kitchen maids about mint and dessert courses. He did not smile at servants as though their words mattered. And yet it had happened, plain as anything, and Alara found herself unable to push the memory aside, even as she plunged back into the demands of the busiest night the manor had seen in years. She had no way of knowing, as she stacked plates and stirred sauces for the rest of that long evening, that the conversation in the garden was only the beginning of something that would soon turn the entire estate, and every noble family within 50 miles, upside down. The days following the ball brought no rest for the kitchen staff of Ashcombe Manor. Guests had stayed late into the night, and the cleanup alone took 3 full days, from scrubbing wine stains out of the good tablecloths to polishing every piece of silver that had touched a single lip during the celebration. Alara worked through it all with the same quiet focus she always carried, though her mind kept drifting back to the garden, to the sound of the Duke's voice, to the way he had looked at her as though her words genuinely mattered. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not remember conversations with kitchen maids. By now he had likely forgotten she existed at all, his attention pulled back into the endless demands of managing an estate and fending off marriage proposals from every corner of the county. It was foolish to think about it further, and yet, try as she might, she could not quite let the memory go. "You have been distracted all morning," Constance said on the 3rd day after the ball, watching Alara nearly overturn a pot of simmering broth. "Is something troubling you, girl?" "No, Mrs. Whitfield," Alara said quickly, straightening the pot and stirring it properly. "Just tired, I think. The ball took more out of all of us than usual." Constance studied her a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, but did not press further. There was too much work to be done for idle questions, and soon enough Alara was swept back into the rhythm of chopping, stirring, and carrying that filled every one of her days. It was nearly a week later when the first sign came that something had changed. Alara had been sent to the manor's small library to collect a stack of books the housekeeper wanted dusted and reorganized, a task usually given to the upstairs maids, but assigned to her that day because 2 of them had fallen ill with a cold. She had never been inside the library before, and despite her exhaustion, she could not help but pause just inside the door, taking in the towering shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with more books than she had ever seen in one place in her entire life. "You look as though you have wandered into a treasure room," a familiar voice said from somewhere among the shelves. Alara froze, her heart leaping into her throat as Duke Edmund stepped out from behind a tall bookcase, a leather-bound volume in one hand. She dropped into a hurried curtsy, nearly losing her balance in the process. "Your Grace, forgive me, I did not know you were here. I was only sent to collect some books for dusting. I will come back another time." "There is no need to leave on my account," he said, closing the book gently and setting it on a nearby table. "This library belongs to the whole household, in a manner of speaking, even if very few of the household ever step inside it." Alara straightened slowly, unsure whether to stay or go, torn between her orders and the strange pull of curiosity that had settled over her the moment she recognized him. "I would not wish to disturb your reading, Your Grace." "You are not disturbing anything. I confess I have read the same page 3 times without absorbing a single word of it." He gestured toward the tall shelves. "Do you enjoy reading?" "I never learned my letters well, Your Grace," Alara admitted, feeling a small flush of embarrassment at the confession. "My mother taught me a little before she passed, enough to read simple things, but nothing like this." She glanced toward the shelves, awed despite herself by the sheer number of books. Something shifted in his expression, though Alara could not quite name what it was. Sympathy, perhaps, or something closer to quiet respect. "That is not a failing on your part," he said carefully. "Not everyone is given the same opportunities. It says nothing about your intelligence, only about circumstance." Alara did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded, gathering the small stack of books the housekeeper had requested from the lower shelf near the door. As she turned to leave, the Duke spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost hesitant. I have thought about our conversation in the garden, he said, more than I probably should have. Alara's hands stilled on the book she carried. Your Grace. It was the first honest conversation I have had in longer than I can remember, he continued, stepping a little closer, though still keeping a respectful distance. Everyone else who speaks to me wants something. A favor, a connection, a marriage that would benefit their family's standing. You wanted nothing at all. You only spoke as though I were simply a person, not a title. He paused, seeming almost surprised by his own words. I found that I missed it in the days since. Alara's cheeks warmed, and she looked down at the books in her arms rather than meet his eyes directly. I do not know what to say to that, Your Grace. You need not say anything, he said gently. I only wanted you to know. A sound from the hallway, footsteps approaching quickly, broke the moment, and both of them straightened at once, an unspoken understanding passing between them that this conversation was not meant for other ears. Alara curtsied once more and hurried from the library, her mind spinning with everything he had said, unable to shake the feeling that something enormous and uncertain had just begun, whether either of them had intended it or not. Over the following weeks, small moments like this continued, never planned, never announced, simply happening in the quiet corners of the manor where their two very different worlds occasionally brushed against each other. A brief exchange in the kitchen garden while Alara gathered herbs. A passing conversation near the stables when the Duke was inspecting a new horse, and Alara had been sent to deliver a message from the head groom. Each time the conversation lasted only a few minutes, but each time something in Alara's heart grew a little lighter, a little more hopeful, even as her mind warned her against such foolishness. She was not blind to the risks. Servants who grew too familiar with their employers, especially employers of such high rank, often found themselves dismissed without warning, their reputations ruined by whispers of impropriety regardless of how innocent the truth actually was. She had seen it happen to another maid 2 years earlier, a girl named Hannah who had done nothing more than smile too warmly at a visiting lord, only to be sent away within the week to avoid scandal. Alara had no wish to share that fate. And yet, despite every warning bell in her mind, she found herself looking forward to those brief, stolen conversations more than she cared to admit. You are humming again, Constance observed one afternoon, nearly a month after the ball, as Alara kneaded dough at the long wooden work table. That is the 3rd time this week. What has gotten into you, girl? Nothing, Mrs. Whitfield, Alara said, though the small smile tugging at her lips betrayed her. Constance narrowed her eyes but said nothing further, though Alara caught her exchanging a knowing glance with Beatrice across the kitchen. She flushed and returned her attention to the dough, silently scolding herself for being so easily read. It was on a quiet afternoon in early autumn, the leaves outside just beginning to turn gold at their edges, that everything shifted once more. Alara had been sent to the orchard at the edge of the estate to collect apples for the week's baking, a task she genuinely enjoyed, as it meant time away from the heat and noise of the kitchen. The orchard was peaceful, rows of trees heavy with fruit, the air smelling faintly of ripe apples and damp earth. She had filled nearly half her basket when she heard hoofbeats approaching, slow and unhurried, and looked up to see Duke Edmund riding toward her on his tall bay horse, dismounting easily once he drew close. I did not expect to find you here, he said, tying the horse's reins to a low branch, though I confess I am glad of it. I was riding without any particular destination in mind. The orchard is one of my favorite places on the estate, Alara admitted, setting down her basket. It is quiet. No one shouting orders, no fires to watch, just the trees and the wind. I can see the appeal. He glanced around at the rows of trees, sunlight filtering through the branches in soft, golden patches. I do not come out here nearly often enough. There always seems to be some matter demanding my attention back at the manor. They walked slowly along the rows of trees together, Alara continuing to pick apples as they spoke, the conversation drifting easily from one topic to another the way it always did now between them. He asked about her mother, and she found herself sharing memories she had not spoken aloud in years, the sound of her mother's laughter, the songs she used to sing while cooking, the quiet ache of losing her too soon. He listened without interrupting, without offering the empty condolences she had grown used to receiving from others, simply present and attentive in a way that made her feel truly heard. In turn, she asked him about his own family, and he spoke of his father with a complicated mixture of respect and lingering grief, of the sudden fever that had taken him before Edmund felt ready to inherit the responsibilities of the title. He spoke of the pressure from his aunt and other relatives to marry quickly, to secure the family line, to choose a bride from among the endless parade of noble daughters presented to him at every social gathering he attended. "None of them ever ask what I actually think," he admitted, plucking an apple from a low branch and turning it over in his hands. "They ask about my estate, my income, my plans for the family's future. No one asks what makes me laugh, or what I enjoy reading, or whether I am happy." He glanced at her, something raw and honest in his expression. "You are the first person in a very long time who has asked me anything at all, rather than simply talking at me." Alara's chest tightened at his words, a strange mixture of warmth and worry settling over her. "Your Grace, I fear I have been too forward with you. It is not my place." "Please," he interrupted gently, "do not apologize for being genuine with me. It is the only reason I find myself seeking you out at all." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I know what this looks like, and I know what people would say if they knew how often I have arranged to cross paths with you these past weeks. I'm not foolish enough to ignore the difference in our stations. But I cannot pretend that our conversations have not become the part of my day I look forward to most." Alara did not know how to respond to something so plainly stated. Her heart pounded, torn between the joy of hearing him admit such a thing and the fear of what it could mean for both of them if anyone discovered the truth of their growing friendship. "Your Grace," she began carefully, "you are a duke. I am a kitchen maid. Whatever this is between us, it cannot lead anywhere good. Your family would never accept it, and I would lose everything I have if word ever spread." "I know," he said quietly, the weight of the truth clear in his voice. "I have thought of little else these past weeks. And yet I find I cannot simply stop myself from wanting to know you better, regardless of how impossible the circumstances may seem." They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the rustle of leaves overhead and the distant call of birds settling in for the evening. Alara knew she should end the conversation, return to her duties, put whatever strange feelings had grown between them firmly back in their place. But when she looked up at him, standing there in the golden autumn light with an honesty in his eyes she had rarely seen from anyone, she found she could not bring herself to walk away either. "We should be careful," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "for both our sakes." "I know," he agreed, "but I do not wish to stop seeing you, Alara. Even if we must be careful about how." It was the first time he had used her name, and something about hearing it spoken so gently in his voice settled deep into her chest, a warmth she knew she should resist but found herself unable to fully push away. As the sun began to sink lower behind the orchard trees, casting long shadows across the grass, Alara realized with a mixture of hope and dread that whatever was growing between them had already gone too far to simply walk back from, no matter how impossible their circumstances truly were. Autumn deepened across the estate, and with it came the arrival of Lady Margaret Halewood, who had been staying with relatives in the north, but returned to Ashcombe Manor determined to finally see her nephew settled with a suitable bride. She swept through the halls like a small storm, summoning stewards, reviewing guest lists, and speaking of little else but the necessity of Edmund choosing a wife before the year's end. Alara heard about it from Beatrice, who always seemed to know everything happening above stairs before the news reached anyone else in the kitchen. "Lady Margaret is furious," Beatrice reported one morning, setting down a stack of clean linens with a dramatic sigh. "She says the Duke has turned down 3 separate proposals this month alone, families with excellent connections too, and he will not give her a single reason why." Alara kept her eyes on the potatoes she was peeling, careful to keep her expression neutral, though her stomach twisted uncomfortably at the news. She knew, of course, exactly why he had turned each of them down, or at least she suspected she knew. though the thought filled her with as much fear as it did quiet, foolish hope. "She has already arranged another gathering," Beatrice continued, oblivious to Alara's discomfort. "A smaller one this time, just a dinner with the Ashworth and Calendar families. She is determined he will make a choice before the season ends." That evening, Alara found herself unable to sleep, lying awake in the small attic room she shared with two other maids, staring at the low, sloped ceiling and turning Beatrice's words over in her mind. She had known from the very beginning that whatever existed between herself and Edmund could never become anything real. She was a kitchen maid with no family fortune, no noble blood, nothing at all to offer a man of his standing beyond her honesty and her company. It had been foolish to let herself grow so attached to their quiet conversations, foolish to let herself hope, even in the smallest way, that circumstances might somehow bend to allow something impossible to happen. And yet, when she closed her eyes, all she could think of was the warmth in his voice when he said her name in the orchard, and the ache that thought brought was sharper than she wanted to admit. The following days brought fewer opportunities for them to speak, as Lady Margaret's presence kept the entire household busier than usual, preparing for the upcoming dinner, and fielding a constant stream of correspondence from families eager to secure an invitation. Alara told herself this was for the best. Distance would allow whatever foolish feelings had taken root in her heart to fade naturally, and life would return to its proper order soon enough. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Nearly 2 weeks after the orchard conversation, Alara was sent late one evening to deliver a tray of tea and biscuits to the Duke's study, as the usual manservant responsible for such tasks had fallen ill earlier that day. She approached the heavy wooden door with careful steps, balancing the tray, and knocked softly before entering at his quiet response. The study was smaller than the library, warmer somehow, lined with fewer books, but filled with maps, ledgers, and papers stacked in careful piles across a large oak desk. Edmund sat behind the desk, a candle burning low beside him, his expression tired in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. "Alara," he said, straightening slightly as she entered, a note of surprise in his voice. "I did not expect you." "Peters is unwell, Your Grace. I was asked to bring your tea instead." She set the tray carefully on the edge of his desk, trying to ignore the way her heart had leapt simply at the sound of her own name spoken by him. "Thank you." He rubbed a hand across his face, glancing at the stack of papers before him with clear frustration. "Forgive me, I am poor company tonight. My aunt has left me a rather long list of families to consider for marriage, and I find myself with very little patience for any of them." Alara hesitated, uncertain whether she should simply leave or offer some small word of comfort. "It cannot be an easy decision, Your Grace, choosing someone to share your life with, simply because a family connection makes sense on paper." "No," he agreed quietly, looking up at her. "It is not easy at all. Especially when the person I find myself thinking of most is someone none of these lists would ever consider a suitable match." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them dared to speak aloud fully. Alara's breath caught, torn between the urge to step closer and the certainty that she should step away entirely. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "you should not say such things to me." "I know," he admitted, standing from behind his desk and moving toward her, though he kept a respectful distance. "I have told myself the same thing every day for weeks now, and yet here I am, saying it anyway." "Nothing good can come of this," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain steady. "You know this as well as I do. Your family would never accept a match between us. I would be dismissed, and you would face scandal and pressure from every corner of the county. Whatever this is, it cannot continue." "I do not want it to end," he said simply, honestly, the words carrying more weight than any grand declaration could have. "I have spent my entire life being told what I must do, who I must marry, how I must behave to honor my family's name. For the first time, I find myself wanting something purely for myself, something no ledger or family connection can measure. I know it is complicated. I know the risks. But I cannot pretend I do not feel what I feel." Tears pricked at the corners of Alara's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let herself fall further into a feeling she knew could only lead to heartbreak. "You are asking me to risk everything I have, Your Grace. My position here, my reputation, perhaps even my future prospects of finding honest work elsewhere if word spreads that I overstepped my place with you." "I am not asking you to risk anything," he said quickly, guilt flashing across his face. "I would never wish harm upon you, Alara. I only wanted you to know the truth of my feelings. What you choose to do with that truth is entirely your decision." A heavy silence settled between them, filled with everything neither of them could safely say. Finally, Alara stepped back toward the door, her hand trembling slightly on the handle. "I should return to the kitchen, Your Grace. Mrs. Whitfield will be looking for me." "Of course," he said quietly, though the disappointment in his voice was unmistakable. "Thank you again for the tea." She left the study quickly, hurrying back through the manor's dim corridors with her heart pounding and her mind spinning in 100 different directions at once. She should stay away from him entirely, she told herself firmly. She should focus on her work, avoid any further private conversations, and let whatever foolish feelings had grown between them wither away before they caused real damage to either of their lives. But even as she made this promise to herself, walking back into the warm, familiar chaos of the kitchen, she knew deep down that avoiding him entirely might prove far more difficult than she wanted to admit, especially now that she understood, without any remaining doubt, exactly how he felt. Word of Lady Margaret's upcoming dinner spread quickly through the household in the days that followed, and preparations consumed nearly every waking hour for the kitchen staff. Alara buried herself in the work gladly, grateful for the distraction it provided from the tangled emotions still swirling inside her chest. She chopped vegetables until her hands ached, scrubbed pots until her arms burned, and fell into her narrow attic bed each night too exhausted to dwell on anything beyond her body's desperate need for sleep. It was, she told herself, exactly the distraction she needed. The evening of the dinner arrived with the same nervous energy that had filled the manor before the grand ball, though on a smaller scale. Only a handful of guests were expected this time, but Lady Margaret's determination that her nephew choose a bride from among them had transformed the preparations into something almost as elaborate as the earlier celebration. Alara worked in the kitchen through the early evening, helping prepare course after course under Constance's watchful eye, doing her best not to think about who might be sitting across from Edmund at that very moment, laughing at his jokes, batting her eyelashes, hoping to secure his favor before the night ended. It should not have mattered to her. She had no right to feel the sharp twist of jealousy that settled in her chest each time she imagined it. And yet, try as she might, she could not push the feeling away entirely. Near the end of the evening, as the final dessert course was being cleared, and the guests began retiring to the drawing room for after-dinner conversation, Alara was sent to collect empty dishes from the dining hall, a task usually reserved for the upstairs staff, but assigned to her that night due to the sheer volume of work still remaining in the kitchen. She moved quietly around the long table, gathering plates and glasses, careful to remain as invisible as possible among the lingering guests still exchanging polite conversation. She had nearly finished her task when she heard Lady Margaret's voice cut sharply through the room, addressing her nephew directly. "Edmund, surely you can spare a moment to properly speak with Miss Calendar. She has traveled quite a distance to be here this evening, and it would be terribly rude to ignore her entirely." Alara kept her head down, focusing on the dishes in her hands, though she could not stop herself from glancing up briefly to see Edmund standing near the fireplace, a young woman in an elegant blue gown beside him, clearly waiting for his attention. He offered the woman a polite, distant smile, the same expression Alara had seen him give countless noblewomen at the ball months earlier, before his gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the far side of the room where Alara stood. Their eyes met for only a brief moment, but it was enough. Enough for Alara to see the same quiet longing reflected there that she had been fighting so hard to suppress within herself. Enough for her to realize, with a mixture of hope and dread, that whatever existed between them had not faded with distance or distraction, no matter how much either of them may have wished otherwise. She looked away quickly, gathering the last of the dishes and hurrying from the room before anyone could notice the exchange, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something far more dangerous than fear alone. The morning after the dinner brought an unexpected summons that sent a ripple of nervous whispers through the entire kitchen staff. Lady Margaret had requested to see Alara directly, in the small sitting room she used for private conversations, and no one, including Alara herself, could imagine a single reason why a woman of such high standing would wish to speak with a kitchen maid at all. "Perhaps you broke something valuable," Beatrice suggested, only half joking, as she helped Alara straighten her apron with hands that trembled slightly from nerves of her own. "I have broken nothing," Alara said, though her stomach churned with anxiety as she made her way up the narrow servants' staircase toward the main house. She found Lady Margaret seated near the window of a small, elegantly furnished sitting room, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. The older woman's expression was difficult to read, composed and cool, though something sharp glinted behind her eyes as Alara entered and dropped into a careful curtsy. "You may sit," Lady Margaret said, gesturing toward a chair across from her own, though her tone made clear this was not a friendly invitation, but rather a demand carefully disguised as courtesy. Alara perched carefully on the edge of the chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting. "I will not waste time with pleasantries," Lady Margaret began, studying her with an intensity that made Alara's skin prickle uncomfortably. "I have noticed my nephew's behavior these past several weeks, his distraction, his reluctance toward every suitable match presented to him. And last evening I noticed something else entirely." She paused, letting the silence stretch long enough to make Alara's heart pound painfully against her ribs. "I noticed the way his attention drifted toward you, even in the middle of dinner with Miss Calendar seated directly beside him." "Your ladyship," Alara began, her voice unsteady, "I assure you nothing improper has occurred between myself and the Duke. I would never presume." "I did not accuse you of impropriety," Lady Margaret interrupted, though her tone remained sharp. "I am simply stating what I observed, and what I observed troubles me greatly, for reasons I believe you already understand." Alara said nothing, unsure whether any response she offered would help or worsen her situation. "My nephew carries the weight of an entire family legacy on his shoulders," Lady Margaret continued, her voice softening only slightly. "This estate, its tenants, its future, all of it depends on him making a wise and appropriate match. A kitchen maid, however pleasant her company might be, cannot provide the connections, the alliances, or the standing this family requires to continue thriving." She leaned forward slightly. "I do not say this to be cruel. I say it because I suspect you understand this truth far better than my nephew currently allows himself to admit." "I understand it completely, your ladyship," Alara said quietly, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. "I have never sought anything beyond a simple conversation with the Duke. I know my place in this household." "Then I trust you will help remind him of his place as well," Lady Margaret said, the warning clear beneath her carefully polite words. "For both your sakes, I would encourage you to keep whatever distance necessary going forward. I would hate to see a promising young girl like yourself lose a secure position over a foolish infatuation that could never lead anywhere real." The threat, though delivered gently, was unmistakable, and Alara felt the full weight of it settle heavily in her chest. "Yes, your ladyship, I understand." "Good." Lady Margaret sat back satisfied and gestured toward the door. "You may return to your duties." Alara left the sitting room with her legs trembling and her mind racing, hurrying down the servants' staircase and slipping into a quiet alcove near the linen closets before her composure fully broke. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall, taking several deep breaths, willing herself not to cry in the middle of the manor where anyone might see. She had known, of course, that this moment would come eventually. Lady Margaret was far too observant, too determined to see her nephew properly married, to overlook something as significant as his growing attachment to a servant. but knowing it might come and actually facing the sharp reality of the warning were two very different things entirely. And Alara found herself struggling to steady her breathing as the full weight of her situation settled over her. She had no choice but to obey. To do otherwise would risk not only her position at Ashcombe Manor but potentially her ability to find honest work anywhere else in the county, should word spread of impropriety, regardless of how unfair or exaggerated such rumors might become. She thought of her father, still living in the small village nearby, dependent on the small wages she managed to send him each month. She thought of everything she stood to lose. For the rest of that day, Alara threw herself into her work with a grim determination, avoiding anywhere in the manor Edmund might reasonably be found. When Constance sent her to deliver a message to the stables, she made certain to check first that he was occupied elsewhere. When she gathered herbs from the kitchen garden, she kept her ears alert for any sound of approaching footsteps, ready to retreat back inside at the first sign of him. It was a difficult, painful sort of avoidance, made harder by the fact that every part of her still wished, foolishly, for exactly the opposite. 3 days passed this way, Alara successfully avoiding any direct encounter with Edmund despite the ache it caused in her chest each time she deliberately chose a different path or found a reason to leave a room before he arrived. She told herself it was for the best. She told herself the pain would ease with time, the way most difficult feelings eventually did. But on the 4th evening, as she carried a basket of freshly laundered linens toward the upstairs closets, a task that should have taken only a few minutes, she rounded a corner and nearly collided directly with him. "Alara," he said, steadying her gently by the elbow before she could stumble, though he released her quickly once she had regained her balance. "I have hardly seen you these past few days. I began to wonder if you were avoiding me entirely." "I have been quite busy, Your Grace," she said, keeping her eyes carefully lowered, her voice as steady as she could manage despite the pounding of her heart. "Alara," his voice softened and she felt rather than saw him studying her closely. "Please look at me. What has happened?" She hesitated, torn between her promise to Lady Margaret and the simple, aching desire to be honest with him one last time. Finally, unable to maintain the pretense any longer, she looked up, and whatever composure she had been holding onto cracked slightly at the concern so plainly written across his face. "Your aunt spoke with me," she admitted quietly. "She made her feelings on the matter of our friendship quite clear, Your Grace. And she is right to have concerns. I should never have allowed myself to grow so familiar with you in the first place. It was foolish of me and dangerous for us both." Something like anger flashed briefly across his features, though it was clear the anger was directed at the situation itself rather than at her. "My aunt has no right to threaten you." "She did not threaten me directly," Alara said, though they both understood the words for what they truly were. "She simply reminded me of realities I already understood even before she spoke them aloud. Your Grace, please, this cannot continue. You know it as well as I do." He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, clearly wrestling with emotions he could not fully voice in the middle of a public corridor where anyone might pass by at any moment. "I will speak with her," he said finally. "This is not her decision to make." "Please do not," Alara said quickly, alarm rising in her chest at the thought of further attention being drawn to their situation. "It will only make things worse, for both of us." She adjusted the basket of linens in her arms, using the small task as an excuse to step back from him slightly, putting a bit more distance between them. "I should finish my duties, Your Grace. Please, let us simply allow this to end quietly, before it becomes something neither of us can control." She did not wait for his response, hurrying past him down the corridor with tears burning at the edges of her eyes that she refused to let fall until she had reached the privacy of the linen closet, where she finally allowed herself a few moments to simply breathe through the ache in her chest before forcing herself back into composure and returning to her duties. She did not know, as she walked away that evening, that Edmund had stood frozen in the corridor long after she disappeared from sight, his hands clenched at his sides, wrestling with a decision that would soon change the course of both their lives far more dramatically than either of them could have anticipated. 2 weeks passed in careful, painful distance. Alara kept her promise to herself, avoiding any situation that might place her in Edmund's path, and though she caught occasional glimpses of him across the grounds or heard his name mentioned in passing conversation among the staff, she made certain never to linger, never to seek him out, never to allow herself the smallest opportunity to weaken her resolve. It was, she told herself repeatedly, the right decision. The only decision that made any sense given the circumstances of their vastly different lives. And yet the ache in her chest did not fade the way she had hoped it would. If anything, it seemed to settle deeper with each passing day, a quiet, persistent sorrow she carried through her work like an invisible weight. Lady Margaret, satisfied that her warning had achieved its intended effect, announced that a second ball would be held before the season's end, a grander affair than the small dinner party, intended to properly showcase Edmund's most serious marriage prospects to the wider county. Invitations were sent to nearly every noble family within traveling distance, and the manor once again buzzed with the frantic energy of preparation. Alara threw herself into the work with grim determination, grateful for anything that kept her hands and mind occupied. She helped polish silver until her fingers ached, arranged flowers throughout the main hall under the housekeeper's careful direction, and assisted in planning menus that would need to satisfy the pickiest of noble palates. Constance noticed the change in her, of course. The older woman had always possessed a sharp eye for the moods of her kitchen staff, and Alara's quiet withdrawal over the past weeks had not gone unremarked. "You have not hummed a single tune in nearly a month," Constance observed one afternoon, watching Alara chop vegetables with unusual mechanical precision. "Whatever happened to put that light back in your step before? It seems to have gone out entirely." "I am only tired, Mrs. Whitfield," Alara said, the same excuse she had been offering for weeks now, though she suspected Constance saw straight through it. The older woman studied her a long moment, then simply nodded, returning to her own work without further comment, though Alara caught the concerned glances Constance exchanged with Beatrice more than once in the days that followed. The night of the second ball arrived with all the same glittering grandeur as the first, though this time Alara found herself dreading it rather than simply enduring it as another demanding evening of work. She moved through the kitchen mechanically, preparing trays and carrying dishes, careful to avoid the main ballroom whenever possible, sending other maids in her place under the excuse of urgent kitchen duties requiring her attention. But near midnight, with the kitchen staff stretched thin and every available hand needed to keep the evening running smoothly, Constance had no choice but to send Alara out with a tray of refreshments, despite her clear reluctance. "I know you have been avoiding the main hall these past weeks," Constance said quietly, pressing the tray into Alara's hands before she could protest. "I do not know the reason, and it is not my place to ask, but I need every pair of hands tonight, and I trust you to conduct yourself properly, whatever is troubling you." Alara had no choice but to obey, steeling herself as she pushed through the swinging door into the noise and light of the ballroom once more. The room looked much as it had months earlier, filled with silk gowns and polished boots, the air thick with perfume and the bright, quick melody of the orchestra. Alara kept her head down, moving carefully along the edges of the crowd as she distributed refreshments, doing her best to remain as invisible as she always had been, before everything had changed. She had nearly finished her circuit of the room when a sudden hush began to spread across the crowd, starting near the center of the dance floor and rippling outward until the music itself faltered and stopped entirely. Confused murmurs rose around her, and Alara, still holding her nearly empty tray, turned to see what had caused such a dramatic silence to fall over the entire ballroom. Edmund stood in the middle of the dance floor, having clearly just stepped away from a young noblewoman mid-conversation, his expression set with a determination Alara had never seen from him before. He was looking directly across the room, and as the crowd's confused whispers grew louder, Alara realized with a jolt of pure shock that his gaze was fixed squarely on her. "Your Grace!" The young woman he had abandoned mid-conversation looked utterly bewildered, glancing between him and the direction of his stare with growing confusion. Edmund did not answer her, Instead, he began walking directly across the ballroom floor, past clusters of stunned guests who parted instinctively to let him through, his eyes never leaving Alara's face. Panic surged through her chest. This could not be happening. Not here, not in front of every noble family in the county, not after everything Lady Margaret had warned her about. She wanted desperately to turn and flee back toward the safety of the kitchen, but her legs seemed frozen in place, her hands trembling around the edges of the tray she still carried. "Your Grace," she whispered as he finally stopped directly in front of her, close enough now that the entire room could clearly see the exchange unfolding, though not close enough to hear the words passing quietly between them. "What are you doing? Please, everyone is watching." "I know," he said, and though his voice remained low, meant only for her, there was a steadiness in it that told her he had made peace with whatever consequences might follow. "I have spent the past several weeks trying to convince myself that distance was the right choice, that avoiding you was the responsible thing to do for both our sakes. I was wrong." "Your Grace, please," Alara said desperately, glancing around at the sea of stunned faces watching their every movement. "You cannot do this. Your aunt, your family, the guests, everyone will see." "Let them see," he said simply, and before she could protest further, he reached out and gently took the tray from her trembling hands, setting it aside on a nearby table. "Alara Finch, will you dance with me?" The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Alara's heart pounded so violently, she feared everyone in the room might somehow hear it. Every rational instinct screamed at her to refuse, to remind him of everything Lady Margaret had warned, to protect both their futures by simply walking away. But when she looked up into his face, into the quiet, steady determination there, something in her own resolve finally broke entirely. "Yes," she whispered, before her fear could talk her out of it. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd as Edmund took her hand and led her onto the dance floor, the abandoned musicians hesitating only a moment before slowly beginning to play once more, though far more subdued than before. Alara felt every eye in the room fixed upon them as Edmund placed one hand carefully at her waist and took her other hand in his own, beginning to guide her through the steps of a dance she had only ever watched from the sidelines, never once expecting to actually perform herself. "I am terrified," she admitted quietly, her voice shaking as they moved slowly across the floor, painfully aware of the whispers rising around them. "So am I," Edmund admitted, a small, genuine smile breaking through his tense expression despite the circumstances. "But I find I would rather face this fear standing beside you than continue pretending. I do not feel what I feel." Across the room, Alara caught sight of Lady Margaret's face, pale with shock and fury, already moving through the crowd with clear purpose, though several guests blocked her path in their eagerness to whisper and speculate about the scandalous scene unfolding before them. Alara knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever consequences awaited them once this dance ended would be severe. But for these few precious minutes, spinning slowly across the ballroom floor in Edmund's arms, surrounded by the shocked stares of an entire county's worth of nobility, Alara allowed herself, for the very first time, to simply feel happy, regardless of the uncertain future that awaited them both the moment the music finally stopped. The music ended far too soon, and with it came the moment Alara had been dreading from the very instant Edmund led her onto the dance floor. Lady Margaret finally broke through the crowd, her face tight with barely controlled fury, and reached them just as the final notes faded into an uncomfortable silence. "Edmund," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs still rippling across the ballroom. "A word immediately." "Not now, Aunt Margaret," he replied, his tone calm but firm, still holding Alara's hand as though he had no intention of releasing it despite the scene surrounding them. "Now," Lady Margaret insisted, her eyes flicking briefly to Alara with an expression that made the young maid's stomach twist painfully. "You have just made a spectacle of yourself, and this girl, in front of every family whose good opinion matters to this estate's future. We will discuss this immediately, in private." Alara gently pulled her hand free from Edmund's grasp, aware of the hundreds of eyes still watching them, aware that every second this confrontation continued in public only made matters worse for everyone involved. "Your Grace, please go with your aunt. I should return to the kitchen." "Ilara's." "Please," she said quietly, though firmly enough that he seemed to understand she needed this moment to escape, to breathe, to process whatever had just happened before the full weight of its consequences descended upon her. He nodded reluctantly, and Ilara turned, hurrying from the ballroom as quickly as her trembling legs would carry her, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her entire retreat. She did not stop moving until she reached the kitchen garden, the same quiet space where all of this had first begun months earlier. And there, she finally allowed herself to sink onto the low stone wall, her hands shaking uncontrollably as the full reality of what had just occurred crashed over her at once. She had danced with the Duke, in front of the entire ballroom, in front of every noble family in the county, including, she realized with fresh horror, the very families Lady Margaret had hoped he might choose a bride from that very evening. There would be no undoing this. No quiet return to invisibility, no simple resumption of her ordinary duties as though nothing had happened. Word would spread through the county faster than any fire, and Ilara had no illusions about how such stories typically ended for servants caught in situations like this one. She sat alone in the darkness for what felt like a very long time, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the ball continuing without her, the musicians having resumed their playing, though Ilara suspected the mood inside had shifted dramatically from what it had been only an hour earlier. Footsteps approached from the direction of the manor, and Ilara looked up, half expecting to see Constance coming to scold her for abandoning her duties, or perhaps even Lady Margaret herself, arrived to deliver whatever punishment she had decided was appropriate. Instead, she found Edmund standing there, his formal coat slightly disheveled, his expression a complicated mixture of exhaustion and quiet resolve. "Your Grace," she began, rising quickly from the wall, "I am so sorry. I never meant to cause such trouble for you." "You caused no trouble," he interrupted gently, closing the distance between them. "I am the one who chose to dance with you in front of the entire ballroom. Whatever consequences follow are mine to bear, not yours." "Your aunt," Ilara said, her voice trembling, "what did she say?" Edmund exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded Ilara uncomfortably of their very first conversation in this same garden months earlier, when he had seemed just as weary of the expectations pressing down upon him. "She said many things, most of them predictable, that I have embarrassed the family, that I have ruined any chance of a suitable match this season, that the Calendar and Ashworth families will likely withdraw their friendship with our household entirely after tonight's display." "I am so sorry," Ilara whispered again, guilt washing over her in waves. "Do not apologize," he said firmly, taking a step closer. "I do not regret it, Ilara, not for a single moment. I regret only that it has placed you in a difficult position, one I should have considered more carefully before acting so impulsively." He paused, his expression softening. "What will happen to you now at the manor? Will Constance?" "I do not know," Ilara admitted honestly. "Servants have been dismissed for far less than what happened tonight. I would not be surprised if Lady Margaret insists upon it before the week is out." A flash of anger crossed his face, quickly followed by something more determined. "I will not allow that to happen. This estate answers to me, not my aunt, regardless of how forcefully she may believe otherwise." "Your Grace, please," Ilara said, alarm rising again, "do not make this worse by fighting with your family over my position. I can find other work, somewhere far from here, somewhere this scandal will not follow me. It would be simpler for everyone." "Simpler, perhaps," he agreed quietly, "but not what I want." He reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. "I meant what I said tonight in front of everyone. I do not wish to hide what I feel any longer, regardless of how complicated our circumstances may be. I understand if you are frightened. I understand if you believe this can lead nowhere good. But I am asking you, honestly, do you wish for this to end here tonight in this garden? Or do you wish to see where it might lead, despite everything standing against us. Alara stared up at him, torn between every rational fear crowding her mind and the simple, undeniable truth of what her heart wanted. The scandal, the risk to her position, the disapproval of his family, all of it remained just as real and just as frightening as it had been before tonight's dance. And yet, standing here in the quiet garden with his hand holding her so gently, she found she could no longer pretend that walking away was truly what she wanted, regardless of how sensible it might be. "I am frightened," she admitted softly, "more frightened than I have ever been in my life." "So am I," he said honestly. "But I would rather face that fear together than continue pretending neither of us feels what we so clearly do." A long moment passed between them, filled only with the quiet chirp of crickets and the distant, muffled music still drifting from the ballroom. Finally, Alara nodded, a small, trembling smile breaking through her fear. "Then let us face it together," she said, "whatever comes next." Edmund's answering smile was the most genuine she had ever seen from him, and for a brief, precious moment, standing together in the darkness of the garden, the weight of everything waiting for them beyond its low stone walls seemed almost bearable, so long as they faced it side by side. But even as hope bloomed cautiously in her chest, Alara knew, with the same clear certainty that had guided her through years of difficult work and harder losses, that the true test of their fragile understanding had not yet even begun. Lady Margaret would not surrender easily, and the whispers already spreading through the county would soon grow into something far louder and far more difficult to escape than either of them could yet fully imagine. The days following the ball brought exactly the storm Alara had feared. By the time the sun rose the next morning, word of the Duke's dance with a kitchen maid had already begun spreading beyond the manor's walls, carried by departing guests eager to share such delicious gossip with anyone who would listen. Within a week, it seemed every household in the county had heard some version of the story, each retelling growing more exaggerated than the last. Alara felt the change immediately within the manor itself. Where the other servants had once treated her with simple, friendly familiarity, now she caught sidelong glances and hushed whispers whenever she entered a room. Some, like Beatrice, seemed genuinely happy for her, offering small smiles of encouragement when no one else was watching. Others regarded her with open suspicion, certain she must have schemed her way into the Duke's attention through some manner of trickery, unwilling to believe that genuine affection could exist across such a vast difference in station. "They are saying you enchanted him somehow," Beatrice reported one afternoon, keeping her voice low as they worked side by side folding linens. "Some silly nonsense about herbs from the garden, if you can believe it, as though you slipped something into his tea to make him fall for a kitchen maid." Alara shook her head, exhausted by the absurdity of it all. "I have done nothing but speak honestly with him, Beatrice. That is the whole of my crime, it seems." "Well, honesty seems to frighten people more than any trickery would," Beatrice said with a wry smile, though her eyes remained sympathetic. "Do not let their whispers wear you down too much. Mrs. Whitfield has been telling anyone who gossips too loudly in her kitchen to find work elsewhere if they cannot mind their own business." Alara managed a small, grateful smile at that, though the constant weight of scrutiny still pressed heavily upon her each day. Beyond the manor's walls, matters grew even more difficult. Several noble families who had previously maintained friendly relations with the Halewood estate began sending pointed letters, some expressing concern for the family's reputation, others more bluntly demanding to know whether the rumors held any truth and what the Duke intended to do about them. Lady Margaret bore the brunt of managing these concerns, and Alara often heard, through the constant flow of servant gossip, of the increasingly tense arguments occurring behind the closed doors of the Duke's study. Edmund, it seemed, remained firm in his refusal to publicly disavow whatever understanding existed between himself and Alara, despite his aunt's mounting pressure. He sought Alara out whenever he could manage it, though their meetings grew more careful and deliberate now, aware of the increased attention their every interaction attracted. They spoke in the quiet hours of early morning, before most of the household had risen, or late in the evening after the manor had settled into stillness. Each conversation left Alara feeling both more certain of her feelings and more anxious about the impossible road stretching ahead of them. "My aunt has written to several of my father's oldest friends," Edmund told her one such evening, meeting her near the orchard where their understanding had first truly begun to deepen months earlier. Seeking their counsel on how best to, in her words, correct this unfortunate situation before it damages the family beyond repair. "What did they advise?" Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would bring her no comfort. "Most suggested I quietly end whatever connection exists between us and proceed swiftly with a suitable marriage to smooth over the scandal," Edmund admitted, his jaw tight with frustration. "A few even suggested finding you alternative employment somewhere far from the estate, to remove the temptation entirely." Alara's stomach twisted painfully at the thought, though she tried to keep her expression steady. "Perhaps that would be the wisest course, Your Grace. I do not wish to be the cause of such difficulty for your family or for the estate's future standing." "I have told them all the same thing," Edmund continued, as though she had not spoken at all, "that I will not be dictated to regarding matters of my own heart, regardless of how inconvenient my feelings may prove for their carefully calculated plans." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I understand the risk this places upon you as well, Alara, and I would never force you to endure it against your wishes. But I will not simply abandon what exists between us, because it fails to fit neatly within the expectations others hold for my life." Despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest, Alara found herself steadied by the quiet conviction in his voice, the same honest determination that had first drawn her to him in this very orchard so many months ago. But conviction alone could not shield them from the mounting pressures closing in from every direction. Nearly 3 weeks after the ball, Alara returned from an errand in the village to find the entire kitchen staff gathered in unusually tense silence, all eyes turning toward her the moment she entered. "What has happened?" she asked, an uneasy feeling settling immediately in her stomach. Constance stepped forward, her expression grave. "Lady Margaret wishes to see you immediately in the main sitting room. She did not look pleased when she gave the instruction." Alara's heart sank as she made her way up the servants' staircase once more, her mind racing through every possible reason for such an urgent summons. She found Lady Margaret waiting in the same sitting room as before, though this time the older woman's composure seemed far more strained, her hands gripping the arms of her chair tightly as Alara entered and curtsied. "I received a letter this morning," Lady Margaret said without preamble, gesturing toward a folded piece of paper resting on the small table beside her. "From Lord Ashworth, informing me that his family, along with several others, intend to formally withdraw all social and business connections with this estate should my nephew's inappropriate attachment to a servant continue unchecked." Alara's breath caught. The Ashworth family held significant influence throughout the county, their friendship valuable to the Halewood estate in ways that extended far beyond simple social standing. Touching on important trade agreements and political alliances the family had cultivated for generations. "Do you understand what such a withdrawal could mean?" Lady Margaret continued, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Tenants dependent upon this estate's continued prosperity, business arrangements that support the entire county's economy, all of it threatened because my nephew cannot bring himself to end an inappropriate infatuation with a kitchen maid." "Your ladyship," Alara said, her voice trembling but steady, "I never sought to cause such harm. If my presence here truly threatens the estate's future so severely, I will resign my position immediately and leave the county entirely, if that would ease matters." Something flickered across Lady Margaret's face at this offer, a brief flash of surprise, quickly hidden. "You would truly leave?" "Without a fight, without attempting to press your advantage over my nephew's clear affection for you." "I never sought advantage, your ladyship," Alara said honestly. "I only ever wished for honest conversation, and somehow that honesty grew into something neither the Duke nor I fully anticipated or planned. If my leaving would spare his family from further hardship, I would rather sacrifice my own feelings than watch the estate suffer for my sake." Lady Margaret studied her for a long, silent moment, something in her sharp expression softening slightly, though whether from genuine reconsideration or simple exhaustion, Alara could not tell. You are either remarkably selfless, girl, or remarkably clever in how you present yourself. I confess I am no longer entirely certain which. I am only honest, your ladyship, Alara said simply. I have never known how to be anything else. A knock interrupted them before Lady Margaret could respond further, and Edmund entered without waiting for permission, his expression immediately tightening as he took in the scene before him. Aunt Margaret, what is the meaning of this? I am simply having a conversation with Miss Finch about the future, Lady Margaret said coolly, though something in her posture had shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. A conversation she has conducted with far more grace and selflessness than I expected, I will admit. Edmund glanced between them, confusion evident on his face, before moving to stand protectively beside Alara. Whatever has been discussed here, I want it understood clearly that any decision regarding Alara's future rests with her, and with me, not with pressure from families more concerned with their own social standing than with genuine happiness. Genuine happiness does not pay the estate's debts or protect its tenants when powerful allies withdraw their support out of scandal, Lady Margaret shot back, though her tone carried less fury than it had during their earlier confrontation on the ballroom floor. But I confess, nephew, that Miss Finch has just offered to remove herself from this situation entirely, for the sake of this family's future, without a single word of protest or self-interest. Edmund turned to Alara, alarm clear in his expression. You offered to leave. I offered what seemed necessary to protect the estate and everyone dependent upon it, Alara said quietly, though she could not quite meet his eyes. I do not wish to be the reason good families suffer, or tenants lose their livelihoods, simply because of feelings that were never meant to exist between us in the first place. No, Edmund said firmly, taking her hand despite his aunt's presence. I will not accept that sacrifice. There must be another way forward, one that does not require you to disappear from my life, entirely simply to satisfy the demands of families more concerned with appearances than genuine character. Lady Margaret watched this exchange with an unreadable expression, her sharp eyes moving between her nephew's fierce determination and Alara's quiet, selfless resolve. Finally, she sighed, a long, tired sound that seemed to release some of the tension that had gripped her since the scandal first broke. Perhaps, she said slowly, almost reluctantly, there is another way forward, though it will require patience, careful planning, and considerably more discretion than either of you have shown thus far. She looked directly at Alara. If you truly possess the character you have just demonstrated in this room, Miss Finch, then perhaps my nephew's judgment in this matter is not quite as foolish as I first believed. Hope flickered cautiously in Alara's chest for the first time in weeks, though she remained wary of trusting it too fully, uncertain what path forward Lady Margaret might actually be willing to consider, and equally uncertain whether such a path, however narrow, could truly lead them toward the future both she and Edmund had begun to quietly hope for. Lady Margaret's cautious shift in attitude did not transform into open support overnight, but it opened a narrow door that had previously seemed sealed shut entirely. Over the following days, she summoned both Edmund and Alara separately for careful, probing conversations, testing the depth of their understanding, questioning Alara extensively about her upbringing, her character, and her genuine intentions, in a manner that felt less like an interrogation and more like a reluctant, thorough evaluation. I still have serious reservations, Lady Margaret told Edmund plainly during one such conversation, which Alara overheard partially while waiting nervously outside the sitting-room door. A match between a duke and a servant has never been managed gracefully in this county's history, and I fear the damage to this family's standing may prove more lasting than either of you currently appreciate. Then help us manage it gracefully, Edmund replied, his voice steady with quiet determination. You have navigated far more difficult social situations than this throughout your life, Aunt. I am asking for your guidance, not your permission. A long silence followed, and when Lady Margaret finally spoke again, her voice carried a note of grudging respect Alara had not expected to hear. "You have grown considerably bolder since your father passed, Edmund. Perhaps that boldness will serve you well, provided it is tempered with proper strategy." What followed was a careful, deliberate campaign, orchestrated largely by Lady Margaret herself despite her earlier objections, to slowly shift public perception surrounding Alara's character and background. She arranged for Alara to receive proper education in reading, writing, and the social customs expected of higher society, insisting that if her nephew truly intended to pursue this match seriously, Alara would need every advantage available to help ease her transition and silence the harshest critics. Alara threw herself into these lessons with the same determined focus she had always applied to her kitchen duties, spending long hours each evening after her regular work concluded, practicing her letters under the patient instruction of the estate's aging governess, absorbing lessons on proper etiquette and conversation that felt, at times, entirely foreign to everything she had known throughout her life. It was exhausting, humbling work, made harder by the persistent whispers still circulating throughout the county regarding the scandalous match. Several families, true to their earlier threats, did withdraw various business and social connections from the estate, a loss that Edmund bore with visible frustration, though he never once suggested to Alara that the cost had grown too high for his liking. Other families, however, particularly those less concerned with rigid tradition, and more curious about the young woman who had managed to capture the notoriously reserved Duke's genuine affection, began cautiously extending invitations for Alara to attend smaller, more private gatherings alongside Edmund, testing the waters of public opinion in careful, measured steps. The first such gathering proved excruciating for Alara, who spent the entire evening acutely aware of every eye watching her every movement, every word she spoke scrutinized for evidence of the common upbringing she could not fully disguise despite weeks of careful instruction. But Edmund remained steadily by her side throughout, offering quiet encouragement whenever her confidence wavered, and by the evening's end, even a few of the more skeptical guests admitted, however reluctantly, that the young woman possessed a genuine warmth and intelligence that could not be easily dismissed. "You handled yourself remarkably well tonight," Edmund told her as they walked slowly back toward the manor's entrance following the gathering, the cool night air a welcome relief after hours of careful, guarded conversation. "I felt as though I might faint from nerves the entire evening," Alara admitted with a tired laugh, though genuine relief colored her voice as well. "I do not know how you have endured such gatherings your entire life without losing your mind entirely." "Practice mostly," he said with a small smile, "and the fortunate ability to simply stop caring what most of these people actually think of me. Though I confess, tonight I found myself caring a great deal about their opinion of you, which made the evening considerably more stressful than usual." Alara smiled, though the smile faded slightly as more serious thoughts crowded back into her mind. "Your aunt still has not fully accepted this, has she? Whatever understanding exists between us." Edmund's expression grew thoughtful. "She has not fully accepted it, no. But she has stopped actively working against it, which I believe counts as meaningful progress, given how firmly opposed she was only weeks ago. I think, in her own careful way, she is beginning to see what I saw from the very beginning, that your character matters far more than your birth." Weeks turned slowly into months, and gradually, painstakingly, the scandal that had once threatened to consume the entire estate's reputation began settling into something closer to cautious acceptance among the county's more reasonable families. Not everyone came around, of course. Several families remained firmly opposed, and Alara suspected some quiet judgments would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless of how thoroughly she proved herself capable of navigating the world Edmund inhabited. But enough support gathered, slowly and steadily, that by the time winter's first snow began dusting the estate's grounds, Edmund felt confident enough to formally announce his intentions to his aunt, and through her, to the wider family and county beyond. The conversation, when it finally happened, took place in the same sitting room where Lady Margaret had first delivered her sharp warning to Alara so many months earlier. This time, however, Alara sat beside Edmund rather than alone across from his aunt, her hand held firmly in his as he spoke. "I intend to marry Alara," Edmund said plainly, no hesitation in his voice despite the weight of the declaration. "I have given this considerable thought throughout these past months, watched her grow and adapt with more grace than most noble daughters I have ever encountered, and I am certain, more certain than I have been of anything in my life, that she is the partner I wish to build my future alongside." Lady Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving between the two of them, taking in the steady conviction in her nephew's expression and the quiet, hopeful determination in Alara's own gaze. "I suspected this conversation was coming," she said finally, a small, tired sigh escaping her. "I will not pretend I harbor no remaining reservations. The path ahead will not be easy, regardless of the progress made these past months. There will always be those who judge Alara harshly for her origins, no matter how thoroughly she proves her worth." "I am aware of that, your ladyship," Alara said quietly, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I have thought of little else these past months, but I have also learned that character, patience, and genuine effort can slowly shift even the most stubborn opinions, provided one remains steadfast and honest throughout the process." Lady Margaret studied her for a long moment, something that might almost have been respect flickering across her composed features. "You have indeed grown considerably wiser these past months, Miss Finch. Perhaps my nephew's judgment was sounder than I initially credited." She turned to Edmund. "You have my blessing, reluctant as it once was, though I expect you both to understand that earning full acceptance from the wider county will require considerably more patience and effort still ahead." "We understand," Edmund said, relief evident in his voice as he squeezed Alara's hand gently. "Thank you, Aunt Margaret." As they left the sitting room together that evening, walking slowly through the manor's quiet corridors, Alara felt a lightness in her chest she had not experienced since long before this entire journey began. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges neither of them could fully anticipate. But for the first time since that first quiet conversation in the kitchen garden so many months earlier, she allowed herself to fully believe that whatever difficulties still awaited them, she and Edmund would face them together, as genuine partners, regardless of the vast difference in the worlds they had each been born into. News of the engagement spread through the county with the same speed as the original scandal, though this time the reaction proved far more mixed than the outrage that had followed the ball months earlier. Some families, particularly those who had grown genuinely fond of Alara during the careful months of gradual introduction, sent warm congratulations and offers of assistance with wedding preparations. Others remained coldly distant, their letters to Lady Margaret expressing continued disapproval of what they considered an inappropriate match unworthy of proper celebration. Alara tried not to let the lingering disapproval weigh too heavily upon her, though some nights, lying awake in the small guest chamber she had been moved into following the formal announcement, doubts still crept in despite everything she had accomplished these past months. She thought often of her father, who had wept with disbelieving joy when Edmund personally traveled to the small village to ask for his blessing, a gesture that had moved the old man so deeply he could barely speak through his tears. "Your mother would be so proud," he had told her afterward, holding her hands tightly in his own weathered ones. "She always said you carried more grace and wisdom than any noble lady she had ever heard tell of. It seems the world has finally caught up to what she always knew." The wedding itself, when the day finally arrived on a crisp morning in early spring, was smaller and considerably less extravagant than tradition typically demanded for a duke's marriage, a choice both Edmund and Alara had made deliberately together. Rather than the enormous, glittering celebration that might have been expected, they chose instead an intimate ceremony held in the manor's own chapel, attended by close family, the estate's most trusted staff, and a modest gathering of the county's more supportive families. Constance Whitfield, given a place of honor near the front of the small gathering, wept openly throughout the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief while Beatrice sat beside her, beaming with unabashed pride at the sight of the young maid. She had worked alongside for so many years, standing at the altar in a simple, elegant gown that suited her far better than any of the elaborate designs Lady Margaret had initially proposed. Alara had insisted on this simplicity from the very beginning, wanting nothing about the day to feel false or performed for the benefit of impressing critics, who would likely never fully accept her regardless of how grand a spectacle she might have staged. She wanted a wedding that felt genuinely hers, reflecting the honest, simple values that had first drawn Edmund to her in that quiet kitchen garden so many months earlier. Edmund had agreed without hesitation, relieved, he confessed, to finally escape the exhausting pressure of elaborate social performance that had defined so much of his life since inheriting his title. As they exchanged their vows before the small gathering, speaking words that felt genuinely meaningful rather than simply traditional formality, Alara found her mind drifting briefly back through everything that had led to this moment. The exhausting kitchen work that had defined her earliest years at the estate, the unexpected conversation in the garden that had changed everything, the painful weeks of forced distance following Lady Margaret's initial warning, the terrifying, exhilarating dance in front of an entire ballroom of shocked nobility, the months of careful, patient work rebuilding trust and proving her worth to a skeptical county, unwilling to easily accept such an unconventional match. None of it had been easy. Much of it had been genuinely frightening, threatening at various points to end in heartbreak and lost opportunity rather than the joy she now felt standing beside Edmund as his wife. But every difficult step had led her here, to this quiet chapel, surrounded by people who had come, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, to recognize her true character regardless of the circumstances of her birth. Following the ceremony, a modest celebration was held in the manor's ballroom, the same room where their entire journey had truly begun with that first shocking dance months earlier. This time, however, there was no scandalized silence, no whispered gossip trailing in their wake. Instead, genuine warmth filled the room as guests offered heartfelt congratulations, many expressing admiration for the quiet courage both Edmund and Alara had shown throughout their unconventional courtship. Even Lady Margaret, watching the celebration unfold with an expression that had softened considerably over the preceding months, approached Alara during a quiet moment in the evening's festivities, offering words Alara had never expected to hear from the formidable woman. "I owe you an apology," Lady Margaret said, her tone unusually gentle. "When I first warned you away from my nephew, I believed I was protecting this family's future. I see now that I was simply protecting outdated expectations that never truly served anyone's genuine happiness. You have proven yourself worthy of this family in every way that truly matters, Alara, and I am grateful my nephew possessed the wisdom and courage to see that truth long before I was willing to accept it myself." Alara, touched deeply by the unexpected apology, embraced the older woman warmly, grateful for the genuine acceptance finally offered after so many months of careful, patient effort. "Thank you, Lady Margaret. Your guidance these past months, even when it began as reluctant necessity, helped prepare me for this life in ways I could never have managed alone. I am grateful for it truly." As the celebration continued late into the evening, Edmund found Alara near the same tall windows where he had once stood, weary and distant, ignoring the endless parade of noble ladies hoping to catch his attention. He wrapped an arm gently around her waist, and together they looked out over the darkened garden below, the same quiet space where their unlikely story had first begun. "Do you remember," he said softly, "standing right here, watching me completely fail to charm a single guest at that first ball?" Alara laughed, leaning comfortably into his embrace. "I remember thinking you looked thoroughly exhausted by the entire affair. I never imagined that exhaustion would somehow lead me to a garden conversation that changed the entire course of my life." "Nor did I," Edmund admitted, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. I only knew from that very first conversation that I had finally found someone who spoke to me honestly, without any hidden agenda or calculated ambition. I did not fully understand then how deeply that honesty would come to matter to me, or how far I would eventually be willing to go to protect it. As the music continued swelling softly behind them, filling the grand ballroom with warmth rather than the cold, judgmental silence that had once threatened to define their story, Alara felt a profound sense of gratitude settle over her. Gratitude not just for the love she had found, but for the courage both she and Edmund had discovered within themselves throughout their difficult journey together. Their story had begun as an unlikely scandal, whispered about across an entire county with skepticism and disapproval. It would end, she now understood with quiet certainty, as proof that genuine character and honest connection could triumph over even the most rigid boundaries society believed impossible to cross, provided two people remained brave enough and patient enough to fight for what truly mattered most. The first year of Alara's life as Duchess of Ashcombe brought challenges she had not fully anticipated, even after months of careful preparation before the wedding. Managing a household of this size required knowledge she was still acquiring, from overseeing the estate's accounts alongside Edmund to receiving visiting dignitaries, whose expectations of proper conduct seemed to shift depending on which family they represented. She stumbled more than once during those early months, mispronouncing a foreign guest's title during a formal dinner, misjudging the seating arrangement for a particularly sensitive gathering of rival landowners, small errors that left her cheeks burning with embarrassment long after the guests had departed. But where she once might have crumbled beneath such mistakes, fearing they proved every doubt her critics had ever voiced about her unsuitability for this new life, Alara found herself steadied now by a quiet confidence that had grown alongside her love for Edmund. She learned from each misstep rather than hiding from it, asking Lady Margaret directly for guidance rather than pretending she already possessed answers she did not have, a humility that slowly won over even the household's most skeptical senior staff members. It was Constance, unexpectedly, who became one of her most valuable allies during this transition. Rather than stepping back from her old position now that Alara had risen so far above her former role, Constance remained head cook of the estate, and the two women maintained a friendship that many outside the household found difficult to understand. A duchess who still occasionally slipped down to the kitchen in the quiet hours of early morning, simply to knead dough, alongside the woman who had trained her, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of work that had once defined her entire existence. "You have not forgotten where you came from," Constance observed one such morning, watching Alara shape a loaf of bread with practiced, easy hands despite the fine embroidered robe she wore over her nightdress. "Most who rise as far as you have would never think to set foot in this kitchen again, let alone dirty their hands with flour." "I never wish to forget it," Alara replied honestly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "This kitchen taught me everything I know about patience, about hard work, about finding dignity in tasks others consider beneath notice. I would be a poor duchess indeed if I let a fine title convince me those lessons no longer mattered." This philosophy shaped much of how Alara approached her new responsibilities throughout that first year and beyond. She took a particular interest in the welfare of the estate's servants and tenant farmers, remembering vividly her own years of exhausting labor, and the small kindnesses that had once meant so much to her when she had nothing else to rely upon. She established better working conditions for the kitchen staff, ensured fair wages were paid promptly rather than delayed, as had sometimes happened under previous management, and personally visited tenant families during difficult harvests to understand their struggles firsthand, rather than relying solely on reports from stewards who rarely set foot in the fields themselves. Word of the Duchess's unusual attentiveness to the common welfare of the estate spread slowly through the county, gradually softening even the harshest remaining critics of her unconventional rise to nobility. Families who had once refused invitations to Ashcombe Manor out of principled objection to the scandalous match began quietly reconsidering their position, particularly as neighboring estates, observing the loyalty and productivity of Ashcombe's satisfied tenants and staff, began wondering whether their own households might benefit from similar reforms. Not everyone came around, of course. A small number of families maintained their cold disapproval permanently, unwilling to ever fully accept a former kitchen maid as an equal within their social circles, regardless of how capably she managed her new responsibilities. Alara learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to accept that such lingering judgment would likely follow her for the remainder of her life. A permanent shadow cast by circumstances of birth she could never fully outrun, no matter how thoroughly she proved her worth through action and character. But she found, increasingly, that such judgment mattered less to her than it once might have. She had Edmund's steady support, a household staff who genuinely respected and cared for her, tenants whose gratitude for her attentiveness felt far more meaningful than the grudging acceptance of distant nobility, and a growing sense of purpose in the work she performed each day managing the estate's welfare alongside her husband. 2 years into their marriage, Alara gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Charlotte, after Edmund's late mother, a gesture that touched Lady Margaret so deeply she wept openly at the announcement. Any remaining reservations about the match fully dissolved in the joy of welcoming a new generation into the family. The birth brought renewed attention from across the county, curious families eager to catch a glimpse of the child born from such an unconventional union. And Alara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, embracing this attention rather than dreading it, proud of the family she and Edmund had built together against such considerable odds. As Charlotte grew, Alara made a point of teaching her daughter the same values that had shaped her own character during those difficult years in the kitchen, ensuring the young girl understood the value of honest work and genuine kindness, regardless of the privilege surrounding her from birth. She often brought Charlotte down to the kitchen garden, the same quiet space where her own story with Edmund had first begun, teaching her small lessons about the herbs and vegetables growing there, about patience, about the satisfaction of tending something carefully until it flourished. "Someday," she told her daughter during one such afternoon in the garden, watching the little girl carefully water a row of young mint plants, "you will hear people speak of how your mother once worked in the very kitchen that now feeds this entire household. Some will say it with kindness, and some will say it with judgment. I want you to know, whichever way you hear it spoken, that I have never once been ashamed of where I came from. It made me who I am, and who I am is who your father chose to love, scandal and all." Edmund, watching from a short distance away, felt his chest swell with quiet pride at his wife's words, a reminder of exactly why he had fought so hard, all those years earlier, to defy the expectations of his family and society, in pursuit of a connection that had proven far more valuable than any calculated, appropriate match could ever have offered him. Looking back on it all now, years removed from that first fateful ball where he had ignored every eligible noble lady in favor of a stolen conversation in a quiet garden, Edmund often marveled at how close he had come to letting fear and social pressure prevent him from pursuing what ultimately became the greatest happiness of his life. Had he listened fully to his aunt's initial warnings, had he allowed the threat of scandal to outweigh the genuine connection he felt from their very first conversation, he would have spent his life bound to a marriage of convenience, comfortable perhaps, but lacking the deep, honest partnership he now shared with Alara. Their story, once whispered about across the county as a scandalous curiosity, gradually transformed over the years into something closer to local legend. A tale told to younger generations as proof that genuine character could triumph over rigid tradition, provided one possessed the courage to pursue it despite overwhelming pressure to conform. Young couples facing their own difficult circumstances, whether differences of wealth, family disapproval, or social expectation, occasionally sought counsel from the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe, drawn by the enduring example of a love that had survived scandal, scrutiny, and every obstacle society had placed in its path. Alara never grew entirely comfortable with being viewed as any sort of legendary figure, preferring instead to think of herself simply as a woman who had been honest about her feelings during a chance encounter in a garden, and fortunate enough to have that honesty returned by a man brave enough to defy expectation in pursuit of genuine happiness. But she understood, in her quieter moments, the significance their story held for others facing similarly impossible circumstances, and she never turned away a young couple seeking guidance, remembering vividly her own fear and uncertainty during those difficult early months of their courtship. As the years continued to unfold, bringing further children, continued prosperity for the estate under their combined careful management, and a slow but steady softening of even the most stubborn remaining critics within county society, Alara often found herself returning, in quiet moments, to that very first conversation in the kitchen garden, the unexpected sound of a duke's voice interrupting her humming among the herbs. She had believed in that moment that such an encounter meant nothing beyond a brief, forgettable exchange between two people who existed in entirely separate worlds. She understood now, looking back across the years that had followed, that it had actually meant everything, the quiet beginning of a story that would challenge every expectation placed upon them both, and ultimately prove that genuine connection, patiently and courageously pursued, could overcome even the widest gulf that birth and circumstance might place between two hearts determined to find their way toward each other regardless of the obstacles standing in their path.